against Minnesota, I scored 4 goals. And then the game against Quebec, the things just happen.
Goes after it. Timo Solani breaks it. He scored!
There's a certain kind of player that every era of professional hockey produces in summing. No imposing frame. No physical presence that fills a doorway. No visible reason for the other team to adjust their pre-game preparation or lose sleep the night before. Joe Mullen looked like that player. He looked like someone the sport might chew up and discard inside of 2 seasons. He stood 5 feet 9 inches. He weighed 180 pounds. The professional hockey world was wrong, and the men who had to find that out the hard way on the ice against him spent the rest of their careers trying to explain what it actually felt like to face someone who had no business being as. Before anyone talks about what it felt like to line up against Joe Mullen, let us look at what the numbers actually say, because the numbers tell a story that the physical description makes no sense of. And that is exactly where the conversation has to begin. Joe Mullen retired as the first American-born player in NHL history to score 500 goals. Stanley Cup championships. He won the Lady Byng Trophy twice for combining excellence with sportsmanship. He was inducted into the Hockey Hall of Fame in 2000. But the number that stops every conversation cold is the plus-minus. Over his career, Mullen was a combined plus 357. In a sport where elite players routinely finish seasons around plus 20 and exceptional seasons reach plus 40, Mullen accumulated plus 357 across his career. That number does not describe a player who occasionally tilted the ice in his favor. It describes a player who made every team he played for fundamentally better in a way that went far beyond what showed up in the goal column. These are not the numbers of a player who slipped through the cracks. These are the numbers of a player the sport somehow underestimated anyway. Brett Hull played alongside Mullen in St. Louis during a stretch when both men were operating at the peak of their offensive abilities. Hull understood elite scoring from the inside in a way very few players ever have. He said that what Mullen brought to the ice was something he had not seen packaged the same way in another player. Hull said Mullen had an economy of movement that was almost impossible to defend against because it never gave you information about what was coming next. Most defensive players have a rhythm, a tell, something in the way they move that a prepared defender can learn to read over time. Mullen moved in a way that was so efficient and so clean that there was nothing extra in it to read. Hull said that defending against Mullen was like trying to read a sentence with no punctuation. You could see all the words, but you could never find the place where one thing ended and the next thing began. That description from a player who scored 741 NHL goals is not a casual compliment. That is a precise technical observation from someone who understood the game at its deepest level. And Mike Keenan coached Mullen and coached against him and spent years building game plans that had to account for what he produced offensively. Keenan said that Mullen presented a specific problem that bigger, faster players did not present in the same way. He said the tendency when preparing for smaller players is to treat the physical matchup as an advantage, to assign a larger defender and trust that the size differential will create enough disruption to limit the offensive output. Keenan said that approach failed consistently against Mullen because his skating and his positioning and his hockey sense neutralized the physical advantage before it could be applied. By the time accounted for, Keenan said that after the first time you tried to use size against Mullen and watched it fail, you stopped thinking about the matchup in physical terms. You started thinking about it in chess terms, and Mullen almost always won at chess. Mario Lemieux played with Mullen during the Pittsburgh Penguins dynasty years that produced back-to-back Stanley Cup championships in 1991 and 1992. Lemieux is one of the 2 or 3 most talented players in the history of the sport. He has stood on the ice beside greatness in a way that very few human beings ever have. When Lemieux talks about teammates, he does not hand out praise casually. He said that Mullen was the most reliable offensive player he played with in terms of producing in the moments that actually mattered, not practice, not regular season games in November against bottom-tier opponents. The moments where the margin for error collapsed and every decision carried the weight of a season behind it. Lemieux said Mullen got better as the stakes got higher in a way that was not common even among the extraordinary players on those Penguins rosters. Think about what that means. Mario Lemieux is telling you that surrounded by Hall of Fame talent in the middle of a championship dynasty, Joe Mullen was the most consistent performer when everything was on the line. That is not a footnote in hockey history. That is the central fact about what kind of competitor Joe Mullen actually was. Paul Coffey was one of the most decorated defensemen in NHL history and spent time as Mullen's teammate during those championship years in Pittsburgh. Coffey said that what separated Mullen from other elite scorers was not the goals themselves, but the situations the goals came from. Most elite scorers accumulate their numbers across a full season. That Mullen's production was disproportionately concentrated in the games and the moments where the opposition was at its absolute best and most prepared. He scored in Game 7. He scored in overtime. He scored when the defensive attention was at its most focused and the margin for error was at its smallest. Coffey said that watching that pattern repeat itself over years and across different teams and different situations stopped feeling like variance and started feeling like character. Like the pressure was not a variable that affected Mullen the way it affected other players, but something he actually used to sharpen himself. The Hell's Kitchen origin story is not background detail. It is the explanation for everything that followed. He was not identified early and placed in a pipeline that groomed elite prospects. He taught himself the game on a surface that was less forgiving than ice in a neighborhood that was less forgiving than most, and he competed against older and larger players from the beginning because that was what was available to him. Scotty Bowman coached more NHL games than any coach in history and won more Stanley Cup championships than any coach in history. When Bowman talks about players he has seen across 5 decades of coaching at the highest level of the sport, his assessments carry a weight that is simply not available to anyone else offering an opinion. Bowman said that Mullen was one of the clearest examples he ever encountered of a player whose competitive foundation was built on something deeper than talent. He said you could see in how Mullen practiced, and how he prepared and how he responded to difficult situations that the drive underneath everything was not external. It did not come from contract years or playoff bonuses or the desire for recognition. It came from something that had been established long before professional hockey was even a realistic possibility. Bowman said players built like that are the most dangerous players in the sport because there is no situation that turns them off, no circumstance where the competitive instinct goes quiet. That assessment from Scotty Bowman is the complete picture of what Joe Mullen was. Craig Patrick was the general manager of the Pittsburgh Penguins during the championship years and made the personnel decisions that built one of the most talented rosters in NHL history. Patrick said that acquiring Mullen was one of the decisions he was most confident in despite the fact that it was not a universally obvious move at the time. He said the evaluation came down to one thing that the statistics confirmed, but that you could also see with your eyes if you watched him long enough. Mullen competed at a level that did not fluctuate based on external conditions. The building size did not affect it. Patrick said that kind of competitive consistency is the rarest quality in professional sports, and that once you identify it in a player, you acquire that player regardless of what the physical profile says about him on paper. 3 Stanley Cup rings, 502 goals. Who the sport had already decided had more right to be there than he did. Joe Mullen himself never talked about what he meant to the players who faced him or what his presence did to opposing teams before games started. He talked about work, about showing up, about the game rewarding the players who refused to allow the gap between what they were and what they needed to become an excuse for anything. The legends who faced him on the ice across 15 NHL seasons carry a specific memory, not of a player who overwhelmed them physically, not of a player who announced his presence with size or speed that announced itself before he ever touched the puck. The memory they carry is quieter and in some ways more unsettling than that. The memory of a player